I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin. And I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our American Academy lecture with Professor Kathleen Thalen on the topic Attention Shoppers, American Retail Capitalism, and the Rise of the Amazon Economy. Professor Thalen will look at the rise of the Amazon economy and analyze how large-scale retailers have capitalized on the uniquely permissive regulatory landscape of the American political economy. About our speaker tonight. So Kathy Thalen is the Ford Professor of Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, generally known as MIT, and her work focuses on the origins and evolution of political and economic institutions in rich democracies. Among her many other distinctions, she has been the president of the American Political Science Association, chair of the Council for European Studies, and president of the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics. She is the author of, among other works, Varieties of Liberalization and the New Politics of Social Solidarity, and How Institutions Evolve, and she is the co-editor of The American Political Economy, Politics, Markets, and Power, which I just happen to have a copy of, and recommend highly. And that last volume is particularly relevant tonight because Kathy has been one of the scholars spearheading a new, do you call it a movement? A school of thought? It's a movement. It's a movement, okay. Called American Political Economy, and that movement has an agenda that, in the words of this very volume, seeks to, quote, understand the interaction of markets and government in America's increasingly polarized polity. It is an agenda that takes a new look at the outsized power of the courts in the U.S., the multiple venues over which interest groups conduct their contestation, and the role of systemic racial division inter alia. There are many other areas of inquiry, but suffice it to say that this is an approach to understanding all the downsides of American exceptionalism. We at the Academy saw this new effort taking flight, and it seemed like something that was deeply important and that we wanted to be involved in, not least because the effort entails in part a re-energizing of comparativism in American political science, and Germany has such a rich tradition in comparativism. The synergies seemed obvious. And for that reason, I contacted Kathy on how we might support the effort, what role we might play. And I won't go through all the different twists and turns that story has, but if you saw today's press release from the Academy, it went out this morning, you may have noticed that we will have a fellow in American political economy here next year, a very distinguished professor, Margaret Weir of Brown University. The Academy's efforts in political economy, I hasten to add, will be funded with a 3-year generous grant from the Hewlett Foundation, which has been at the forefront of this work. So when I tracked down Kathy Thalen, I was delighted to find out that she was not only a longtime Germanist, she was in fact in Germany, teaching or researching at the Technische Universität in Munich this year. So naturally, I invited her to Berlin, a city that she knows well from being a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg, a visitor at the WCB, and many other times here in our city. And just to rattle off a few of her other credentials as a Germanist, she is also a permanent external member of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne, and she was elected to the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2009. She is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, having been elected in 2015. Kathy has a basketful of awards, too numerous to recite, but among them are the Aaron Wildavsky Enduring Contribution Prize. I would like a prize for an enduring contribution. I would be satisfied with one for even a brief contribution. The Michael Endres Research Prize, the Barrington Moore Book Prize, and the Max Planck Research Award. She is the general editor of the Cambridge University Press Series in Comparative Politics, and has innumerable other publications and honors to her name. Let me just briefly say a few words about our format. This is a aspect of all hybrid events the world over now. Kathy's talk will last for about 30 minutes, and then we will have a discussion and an audience Q&A. If you're here, raise your hand to ask a question. And if you are joining via Zoom, please type your question into the Q&A part of the platform, not the chat, and we will do our best to get to the questions. And with that, Professor Thelen, the podium is yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for the invitation to come here and for that wonderful dinner that we just had. I'm really just delighted to be here, and thank you especially also for the plug for the movement that we have started together with a couple of colleagues of mine from Columbia, Yale, and Berkeley. We're all very excited about it. So. As Dan said, my talk today is on, this is actually a book that I've been working on American retail. And I became interested in retail more or less as I watched Amazon and Walmart sort of battling it out in the market. And in particular during the pandemic, when Amazon sort of began to pull away in the area of e-commerce. So I'm interested in the American case, partly because I'm an American, but also because the U.S. is really typically seen, and for good reason, as the kind of quintessential consumer society. Consumption and, by extension, retailing are really central to the United States' demand-driven growth model. So it turns out that retailing and distribution is substantively an important sector in all of the rich democracies. It accounts for something like 10 to 15% of jobs across all OECD countries, which actually puts it close to manufacturing in many countries. It's even higher in the United States. As you see here, in 2003, the number of Americans working in retail surpassed the number working in factories in that year. And in the last couple of years, really, retail has overtaken manufacturing as kind of the leading sector in the leading force in economic growth in the U.S. So in terms of employment, large discount retailers specifically are by quite big margins, the biggest employers in the United States. And although I think it's fair to say, European retailing has been in many ways moving in the direction of American retailing, or at least on many dimensions. But I think it's fair to say that the U.S. still stands out in some ways. So for starters, the U.S. just has way more retail space per capita than most of Europe. And that's a function of these gigantic shopping centers that you find in almost all American suburbs. What you see on the right here is the famous Mall of America in Minnesota, which has 500 stores. It has literally tens of thousands of shopping spaces. These big discount retailers are also quite ubiquitous in the United States. Walmart, Target, they're really all over the place. It turns out that 90% of Americans live within 15 minutes of a Walmart. And these places are basically always open. One of the big, I think, remaining differences between Europe and the United States in this is that the shopping hours are still much more regulated in Europe than they are in the U.S. And then last but not least, these huge low-cost retailers are enormously popular in the United States. So what you see here is a Morning Consult survey from 2019, which shows that Amazon was really at the top of the list in terms of America's most loved brands. On the right, I can't say, this is not the most scientific study in the world on the right, but you can see that Germans are much more likely to talk about the car companies. So what do we know about the politics of retailing? So there is some really wonderful work, I would say, on consumer culture and consumer credit, especially by cultural and economic historians and also sociologists, and I draw on some of this. But almost all of this work is really focused very narrowly on a particular slice of history, a particular slice of time, especially in the immediate post-war period in the United States when you had a big boom in consumption. And also none of this work really is on the retail sector per se, which is the focus of my work. So political scientists and political economists, for their part, I think we, include myself here, haven't had that much to say about retail at all. So economists who study retail tend to lean toward kind of apolitical explanations for the success of these mega retailers. It's a story about the size of the American market, about technological or organizational innovations on the part of these kind of brilliant entrepreneurs. Unsurprisingly, I'm a political scientist, so the explanation that I offer is going to be a lot more political. I want to argue that mass retailers in the U.S. were not simply responding to market opportunities, they were creating them. And they were creating them by exploiting regulatory gaps to grow in size and scale. So legal scholars have offered a somewhat more political explanation or political version of the rise of these large retailers in the U.S. So there's a kind of seminal article by Lena Khan, who you see on the screen here. She's currently head of the Federal Trade Commission, and she attributes the rise of Amazon, in particular, to the ascendance of the so-called Chicago School of Law and Economics, which got its start in basically the 1960s. And this is a school of thought that placed consumer welfare, defined essentially as price, at the center of American jurisprudence and theory. So clearly, the rise of the Chicago School has been extremely important. And as you'll hear, antitrust is going to play a very big role in the explanation that I've been developing. Courts are an enormously important player in the political economy, particularly in the United States, and I think it's an arena that has been almost entirely overlooked by political scientists and political economists like me. But where I'm going to part ways with this mainstream legal scholarship is that I want to argue that these changes in the 1960s, this rise of the Chicago School, is really just the latest chapter in a far longer story, one in which large retailers have basically always enjoyed a very privileged position within the context of the American antitrust regime. So finally, comparative political economists, for their part, have not really had all that much to say about the politics of retail or the politics of distribution generally. The focus of almost all of this work, and I include my own very much in this, has overwhelmingly been on the politics of production, the politics of manufacturing, right? So to the extent that comparative political economists have addressed these kinds of questions, that literature tends to focus not so much on the politics of retailing, but on the politics of consumer credit. And in particular, the expansion of credit, consumer credit, in response to the Great Depression after Roosevelt. This, too, is clearly important, but I want to argue that the focus on credit has tended to obscure the role of these big discount retailers that always stayed away from credit sales, but that have had, I think, a huge impact, not just on the American retail landscape, but on the American political economy as a whole. So the project that I've been writing traces the origins of what I'm calling the Amazon economy back to the late 19th century. This is a period when large-scale retailers began to capitalize on what I consider to be the uniquely permissive regulatory landscape in the United States in order to basically outgrow the capacity of the government to regulate them. So two features of the American political economy figure prominently in the explanation that I've been developing. One is the role of the judiciary. And an antitrust regime that, as I said, from the beginning really gave mass retailers enormous advantages, and in ways that I think are very distinct from Europe. And the second factor is regulatory fragmentation. And here basically I mean a political landscape that assigned most of the regulatory powers to state and local governments, which turned out to be no match for these large retailers who, not least because of the big head start that they had received from the courts, were soon operating on a national scale. So the argument in a nutshell is that judicial forbearance and regulatory arbitrage allowed American retailers to grow and to win over an ever-expanding support coalition of groups that over time came to rely on these big retailers in various ways. And then, of course, those groups could then be weaponized and were weaponized to defend these companies in their political battles with would-be regulators. So it's a whole book, and I'm not going to try to give you a comprehensive treatment. Instead, what I want to do is just zoom in on a couple of key junctures on the screen here, where these dynamics, I think, were in evidence and where the politics were playing out rather differently from Europe. So the first is the construction of a mass market. So in the 19th century, of course, there was no mass retail market anywhere. There wasn't one in Europe. There wasn't one in the United States. What you had is basically a bunch of small merchants scattered all over the place. At each of these little shops, of course, there was extremely limited selection. Prices were very high, partly because these little shops were at the end of pretty long supply chains, but also because each one of them, of course, operated within its area as a kind of little monopoly. So in Europe, consumer co-ops emerged to challenge these small retailers, and they grew to become the first mass retailers. So workers or farmers would join together to pool resources in order to get better prices by purchasing in higher volume and then sell directly to their members. So these local co-ops would then scale up by developing ties to other cooperatives, other neighboring cooperatives, sort of growing from the bottom up and out until they reached national scale. So this happened all across Europe, most famously, I would say, in Scandinavia, where cooperatives, those co-ops that were founded in the late 19th century, are still very major players in the retail landscape to this day. However, the earliest and actually most successful of these, example of this, emerged in America's closest cousin, namely Britain. And this took the form of the so-called Cooperative Wholesale Society. And this grew out of these local co-ops, but it really took off after legislation in the 1850s and 1860s, in particular 1862, put these cooperatives on very stable legal footing and also allowed individual co-ops to coordinate their activities, which is what allowed for the formation of a national society, a co-op of co-ops, if you will, that became the largest retailer in the world in the late 19th century. And then, as in other countries, this National Cooperative Association in Britain also integrated backward in order to begin producing some of the goods that they sold. And so what you see on the right here is one of the production facilities of the Cooperative Wholesale Society. Similar cooperative ventures were also getting founded in the United States in this period as well. So some of you, if you know about American history, may have heard of the Grange movement and its successor, the Farmers Alliance. These were extremely famous in American history as the kind of main organization through which American farmers organized both their political and their economic demands. And they became hugely important in the populist revolt against monopoly power in the late 19th century. So starting in the 1860s, local Grange chapters were organizing themselves often into co-ops, both to try to secure higher prices for their goods, but also so that they could pool orders in order to lower costs for their members on some of the goods that they needed. However, whereas cooperatives in Europe were really flourishing or began flourishing in this period, they failed to thrive in the United States. And it's a little bit of a complicated story, but the short version is that unlike in Europe, there was no national legislation in the late 19th century that could clarify the legal standing of these operations and that explicitly sanctioned their activities. What you had instead were basically a bunch of state courts sort of applying their own, often quite different understandings of how the common law applied to these cooperatives. And these states did not all take the same position on this matter. And in fact, some of them viewed this kind of local, of sort of joint marketing and distribution that really stood at the center of the whole cooperative project understood these activities to be conspiracies in restraint of trade. Okay? Moreover, even when individual states sometimes passed explicitly legislation that legalized, exempted these cooperatives from these kinds, from prosecution under those laws, these laws were sometimes struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, either on grounds of equal protection, often, or later after the Sherman Act as a violation of federal antitrust laws. And this is, of course, quite paradoxical because agrarian interests had provided a great deal of the impetus behind the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which was, of course, supposed to be directed at the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers of the world, but what perversely came to be deployed against their own cooperative associations. So the failure of those ventures provided an enormous opening for private corporations to move into this space because individual companies that were organizing all these, coordinating functions internally, they were, of course, outside the scope of antitrust laws. There's no collusion, there's no conspiracy if you're a single private entity, right? So Montgomery Ward was actually the one to really open the kind of vast consumer market in the United States in the South and the West. But it was this guy, Richard Warren Sears, who really came to dominate this market. And he moved in with an extraordinarily aggressive strategy, very high volume sales, very thin margins, very low prices, and on an insanely wide range of products. So when it was founded in 1886, the Sears catalog, if you want to call it one, was actually a one-page flyer. All he sold was watches, but within just 20 years, this catalog was thousands of pages long, and you could literally order everything from toothbrushes to entire prefabricated houses that would come to you with all the millwork done, and you had the assembly instructions for how to put the thing together. It's sort of like when you order IKEA furniture or something, and it comes with the instructions. Some of these actually are still standing. You can see them in the American Midwest. So the expansion of these companies across the U.S. would not have been possible had it not been for the way that they were able to exploit public infrastructure for private purposes. And here the U.S. postal system played an absolutely critical role because this was going to provide these companies not just with a subsidized means of getting their goods and their catalogs to this widely dispersed rural population, but also, and I would say much more importantly, local post offices were going to serve as the critical intermediaries in the financial transactions that these companies were having with their customers. Okay, so in Europe, as I said, the cooperatives had grown from the bottom up, kind of through federation, basically. So you had local branches all over the place, and you could sell things for cash, or maybe you could let somebody run a tab, but it was basically cash. Montgomery Ward and Sears, by definition, did not have retail outlets, right? Moreover, almost all of their rural customers, virtually all of their rural customers, were unbanked, right? They had no bank accounts. They were operating on a cash economy. So how are you going to do these sales? So you could, of course, send cash through the mail, but if any of you have seen American Westerns, you will know that stagecoaches that carried the mail were just always getting, robbed. And so this was not a great solution. So none of this really would have worked without the money order system, the money order service that the U.S. Postal System offered. And this was a service that had been introduced earlier, and for completely different reasons. It was actually introduced during the Civil War to allow Union soldiers to get their salaries, their money back home safely. But these retailers were able to repurpose this public service in order to serve as a critical financial intermediary. And just to give you a sense of how much a company like Sears depended on the infrastructure of the U.S. Postal System, here are the instructions from a 1908 Sears catalog. It says, if you live on a rural mail route, just give the letter and the money to the mail carrier, and he will get the money order at the post office and mail it in the letter for you. So this is how these first American mass retailers were able to reach and also win over millions of rural customers who now had access to an almost unlimited range of standardized consumer goods and at prices their local merchants couldn't hope to match. And then once they had this loyal, you could almost say captive consumer base, they could also mobilize them as a powerful ally in their political battles. And one of the most important of those battles was to secure legislation to expand postal services to carry more and bigger packages, parcel post. This is something that was of clear value to companies like Sears, but it was very much opposed by first of all, by the big express companies who otherwise were getting paid to carry these goods, and also, of course, by these small merchants that were getting put out of business by the likes of Sears. So when legislation on parcel post was being considered, mass retailers weaponized their rural consumers, among other ways by encouraging them to blanket Congress with petitions, which they did. So what you see on the right is that petitions in favor of parcel post, most of them, if you look at the content, most of them are coming from those areas. They spiked. The number of petitions going into Congress spiked at precisely those times when Congress was considering this legislation, considering funding this service. And then when it came time for the vote, virtually all of the support that carried this legislation came from Democrats in the South and West. This is what you see in the dark blue. Those were exactly the areas that relied virtually exclusively on these mail-order companies to link them into this national market. So parcel post then ushers in this kind of golden age of mail order. Sears, in the very first year of parcel post, Sears sales went up by fivefold, and Montgomery Ward was not very far behind. So in this first period, large mail-order companies were enjoying extremely favorable treatment under American antitrust, and they proceeded to grow by exploiting and repurposing public infrastructure for private ends. This then sets the scene for the really explosive growth of chain stores in the early 20th century. So the early 20th century and the interwar period in the U.S., the so-called progressive era and the roaring 20s, this is this really paradoxical period in American history. It's one that's characterized pretty much simultaneously by extremely high and rising inequality, both wealth inequality, which is what you see here, but also income inequality. But it was also a period that saw a boom in consumption and consumer spending. So Americans were buying things like washing machines and vacuum cleaners really decades before their counterparts in Europe. So how did the average American get this stuff? Part of the answer is that establishers were already finding ways to sell things on credit, and that's another story of regulatory arbitrage that we could also talk about. But the other development that happened and that really fueled consumption in the 1920s is the phenomenal growth of chain stores, which operated on a cash-only basis. So you had all these new entrants like Woolworths, JCPenney, Ben Franklin. They did not offer credit. They were competing exclusively on price. These chains grew exponentially, just explosively in this period. In just 10 years, 1920 to 1930, I put some figures on the screen so that you could get a sense of the order of magnitude. What you also see is that these sorts of chains were not making the same kind of headway in Europe, and that's largely because these kinds of operations were encountering much stiffer headwinds in Europe. In other words, the politics were playing out rather differently on the two sides of the Atlantic. So conflicts in this period centered on two issues in particular. One is resale price maintenance arrangements, and the other is special taxes on large retailers. And I want to talk very briefly about each of these to kind of underscore some of the differences to Europe. So resale price maintenance arrangements involve contracts through which manufacturers commit retailers to charge a certain minimum price for their products. These are promoted by manufacturers of patented goods, especially who want to kind of protect the reputation of their brand. But of course, small retailers, of course, also love these kinds of arrangements because if everybody has to charge the same price, this is going to relieve them of some of the price pressure that they would otherwise face from these larger and more efficient firms. So in that sense, resale price maintenance reflects or maybe even creates a kind of alliance between brand manufacturers and small merchants, both of them against lower cost retailers who in this period in the United States are explicitly advocating for what they call the right to cut prices. So resale price maintenance contracts were perfectly legal and in fact widespread in Europe throughout the interwar period. And in fact, in most cases, they survived well into the post-World War II period, typically until the 1960s or even into the 1970s. Resale price maintenance wasn't banned in Germany until 1974, and I think it's still in effect for book publishing. And this, too, goes back to this really different approach to antitrust policy because unlike in the United States, courts in Europe in the early 20th century were holding more closely to this principle of freedom of contract, including, crucially, by recognizing agreements that under American law were considered anti-competitive and were therefore illegal. So resale price maintenance arrangements were not just legal, however, in Europe's so-called coordinated market economies, which you might expect, but they were also perfectly legal in Britain, which is a fellow liberal market economy and indeed a country that shares America's common law tradition. So the organizational vehicle through which those arrangements operated was the so-called British Proprietary Articles Trade Association, founded in 1896. And this was an outfit that brought together manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers who jointly administered and policed a list of protected prices on trademarked goods. So what I'm about to describe would have been 100% illegal in the United States. But the way it worked is that manufacturers set their prices. Retailers out there would then monitor those prices and notify the association if some retailer was found to be violating the price. And then the association would collectively enforce the manufacturer's price by putting that retailer on a so-called stop list, which then obliged all association members to stop supplying them. So small independent retailers were, of course, huge beneficiaries of this because this channeled competition in Britain sort of away from prices and toward competition centering more on service. The situation in the United States was radically different. From very early on, in 1911 at the very latest, the Supreme Court made clear that resale price maintenance arrangements were per se illegal under prevailing antitrust. So the landmark case here was one that pitted a big discount drugstore, a price cutter, against a small manufacturer of patented medicine. And in this case, the court ruled in favor of the big drug chain, basically giving retailers control over the prices that they charged. So this was a case that was extremely controversial in the United States. It inspired the formation of a so-called Fair Trade League that advocated changes in antitrust law to basically allow smaller firms to engage in more coordination in order to protect themselves from domination from these large corporations and to steer competition away from prices and toward things like innovation and quality. So the Fair Trade League had some very prominent supporters and advocates, including future Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who you see on the screen here, among others. And Brandeis was actually quite aware of what was happening in Europe on this score, and he actually admired some of the aspects of this alternative model of managed capitalism that were developing there at the time. And so he and other progressives really saw this ban on resale price maintenance as simply encouraging ruinous price competition. It would encourage a race to the bottom. It would lead to monopoly because it would lead to the killing off of these smaller, more innovative competitors. But American fair traders were basically stymied by the courts throughout the 1920s. In other words, throughout exactly that period that I said when the chain stores were experiencing this explosive growth. The situation did change a little bit in the 1930s, now in the midst of the Great Depression. At this point, or by this time, Brandeis was on the bench, and the Supreme Court relaxed the rules on what states could do in this area. And so some, in fact, quite a few states actually did pass so-called fair trade legislation. But very different from Europe, brand manufacturers could still not legally and openly enlist the help of retailers or of other producers in defending the prices that they were setting. That was still, of course, completely illegal under American antitrust. So that meant that enforcement ran entirely through the courts. So individual retailers would have to chase after individual violators. And this, of course, made it prohibitively expensive, especially for all these small firms that people like Brandeis had been interested in protecting. Moreover, state laws, by definition, only covered intra-state trade, and so that didn't do very much to stop these national chains because they could simply engage in all sorts of regulatory arbitrage, switching up their sourcing in order to avoid fair trade states, or often simply buying the entire output of a supplier. Chain Store Age, which was and is the main trade magazine, was at the time publishing articles on how to get around these laws. So basically, too little and too late. So running parallel to all these battles over resale price maintenance during the Depression were other efforts to slow the chains down in other ways. And this took the form of efforts to impose heavy taxes on these chain stores. This is something, obviously, that small retailers also would have loved to see happen. So what you have here is a kind of sample of some of the rhetoric of the time. These guys are vicious price cutters. They're running legitimate retailers out of business. They're callous foreign entities. They don't contribute anything to the local economy. And actually, these campaigns against the chains were pretty successful. Particularly in the South and the West, because by this time those variety chains that I talked about earlier were having a really big presence in those areas. Plus, it's the Depression. And during the Depression, populism enjoyed a big renaissance. Wall Street bankers were being blamed for the Depression, so people like, populists like Huey Long were weighing in here saying, I would rather have thieves and gangsters than chain stores in Louisiana. So in fact, chain store taxes did get passed in many of these states. But again, they ran into trouble in the courts throughout this period. Sometimes first of all, they ran into trouble in the 1920s, but even after that, state taxes were often struck down usually on equal protection grounds under the 14th Amendment. But even when these state taxes weren't struck down, chains were again so big that they could engage in these sorts of regulatory arbitrage, kind of reorganizing their operations to avoid these taxes. So state-level regulation was clearly ineffective. And all of this kind of culminated in 1938 in one huge, I would say, kind of last-ditch effort to impose a chain store tax at the national level. And that was spearheaded by this guy, Texas Representative Wright Patman. Some people call him America's last populist. But his proposal really went down in flames because by this time, the chains were able to mobilize a whole bunch of allies in big public relations campaigns. And so what you see here is, they do things like sponsor a referendum in order to mobilize voters. Here you see advertising from a referendum in Utah where basically the chains are saying, like, if you tax us more, we're going to pass that right on. It's going to mean higher prices for you. And so when the time came to consider Patman's legislation in the Congress, a whole bunch of groups came out of the woodwork and suddenly were defending the chains. So you had farmers and farm organizations turning out in support of the chains because in the meantime, they were now depending on these grocery chains as an efficient way to distribute their products, and especially because the chains would often help them unload periodic surpluses, which was a huge problem for American farmers. Manufacturers were now increasingly capital intensive. They loved the kind of predictability that these big retailers could provide because they would order in such large volume and well ahead of schedule. And finally, consumers had become hooked on the chains. Consumers in the U.S. historically have been represented by women's groups, women's clubs, and so they turned out in congressional hearings to defend the chains as kind of the go-to source of low-cost goods. And so by the late 1930s, really just a few years after this movement had begun, the movement to tax chain stores was really quite completely spent. This is an article from the New York Times from 1939. Now states are repealing their state chain store taxes. Now they're actually competing to have lower cost retailers in their jurisdictions. And then in 1938, this is a survey from 1938. This is exactly when the Patman legislation was getting considered. And basically, the question that they were posed is, what do you think would be the best policy toward the chain stores? And as you can see, well, maybe you can't see, but by far the most popular answer is let them make whatever profits they can, rather than taxing them extra or getting rid of them entirely, which had been Patman's objective. So basically, the politics of retailing in the 1930s and 20s and 30s, I would say, were very different from Europe. Large retailers had already benefited from this enormous head start that they had achieved, partly through the ban on resale price maintenance. And once they were operating on a national scale, they were able to work around whatever state legislation did get passed in this kind of fragmented regulatory landscape. And of course, as they grew, they were assembling this ever-growing support coalition that they could mobilize whenever they faced a new regulatory threat. So finally, and very briefly, to the post-World War II period. So this is the period, obviously, that saw the kind of full flowering of the American consumption-driven growth model. This is the period that's famous for the boom in construction, largely as a function or as a result of the government-sponsored housing booms. And this is the period which saw the growth of the suburbs and, of course, these big shopping centers in the suburbs that I showed you. But even as these new suburban shopping centers were reconfiguring the geography of shopping, you also had disruptive new entrants to the retail sector who were going to redefine the temporal parameters of shopping. So, as I mentioned at the outset, despite, I think, a lot of liberalization in shopping hours, it's still the case that shopping hours in Europe are much more regulated than they are in the United States. Shorter days, but especially Sunday shopping, far more restrictions on Sunday shopping. And that was actually the case in the United States as well in the 1950s. Sunday shopping was not a thing. But all of this started falling apart in the 1960s with the arrival of these very disruptive new discounters. So there were a bunch of kind of small operations that kind of flamed out after a decade or so. But this is also the period when you had the founding of these bigger and much more durable chains such as Kmart, now gone, but Target and Walmart. All three of those, the big ones, were all founded in the same year in 1962. And these discounters, all of them, were challenging established retailers not just on price, although also on price, but also by simply staying open both evenings and Sundays, which again at the time was not heard of. So again, small retailers and their allies mobilize to try to impose some restrictions on this. They were joined by religious groups, and also, frankly, they were joined by department stores. Department stores had higher staffing, and so they were not interested in paying for longer hours. But it is really the same basic story. Again, you get a kind of flurry of state and local legislation that attempts to regulate Sunday selling. These laws took a variety of different forms. Some of them tried to ban the sale of things other than so-called necessities. Some of them tried to limit Sunday selling to particular kinds of retailers. Some of them tried to prohibit only large retailers from being open. But even where those laws were passed, discounters flagrantly ignored the rules and simply paid the fines, right? Absorbing the legal costs as basically a part of the business expense. In a way, it's very reminiscent to me of how Uber operated when it entered the U.S. market. Uber basically ignored all of the local transportation laws, and they just paid all the fines as they scaled up. And it was the same kind of story there. So in Europe, of course, this kind of rule breaking met with the opposition, not just of small retailers and religious groups, but also unions. Now, in the United States, of course, unions are very weak, particularly in retail, but not just in retail. And so enforcement, again, ran through the courts. And when these things got litigated, retailers very often won. And they were able to prevail because they were able to claim discriminatory treatment, which is something that U.S. courts will often powerfully defend. And then, as these cases dragged on, these stores stayed open. And people got used to it. And once they got used to it, they wanted to keep it. And so here is a survey from 1977 saying, how would you feel about a law against retail stores being open on Sundays? And as you can see, basically everybody said, no, don't let them close. We don't want them closed on Sundays. And so this whole thing kind of culminates in a pretty crucial case before the New York Court of Appeals, which threw out a state law which had been trying to limit shopping hours and the reasoning was based on the observation that these laws were incoherent, they were unenforceable, and the court said that this was dangerous because this encouraged this, what they called erosive disrespect of the law. So over the next years, states basically abandoned their blue laws or they just stopped enforcing them, and this is basically how we wound up with this kind of uniquely unregulated shopping hour regime that we have today. So I want to wrap up briefly, not by repeating the argument, but by just panning out a little bit to highlight the significance of these developments as I see them for the American political economy as a whole. So one of the reasons that I think it's important to think about the evolution of discount retailing specifically, alongside the kind of better known story of the rise of, credit and so forth, is that it gives us a somewhat different angle on the crisis of American manufacturing and rising inequality since the 1970s. So the way that story is typically told is that American manufacturing declined in the face of competition from lower-cost producers abroad. And that's what destroyed all these unionized, relatively well-paid jobs, and that's what left us with a very, very, very large number of low-skill, low-wage service sector jobs. So in that model, the pressures on American manufacturing are entirely exogenous. Right? American retailers are playing no particular role here. They're just acting as a kind of passive transmission belt. These stores are just offering consumers a choice. Consumers are just then going for the lower prices. But in the story that I'm telling, large retailers are playing a much more active role in the decline of American manufacturing and really the post-war growth model generally. I think it's important that the factors that I'm trying to highlight here, this legal regime and this fractured regulatory landscape, that is what promoted a particular model of retailing to dominance. It's an ultra-lean retailing model based on extremely narrow margins and dominated by players, Walmart and now Amazon, that enjoy tremendous power both over workers and over their suppliers. Right? So they're cutting labor costs to the bone, but they're also forcing the manufacturers who supply them to accept ever narrower margins and therefore to cut their own costs. And these are pressures that, of course, those manufacturers pass on to workers. And in the United States, in the fragmented regulatory landscape we have, you can do that first by escaping to the non-union South, and of course then later by relying on low-cost producers abroad. And then once you are in this cycle of low margins and low wages, you also then have a population of low-income workers who really rely on these low-cost retailers in order to make ends meet. And then I would say what makes these companies really hard to regulate in the United States is that just as in the past, all the while that they're growing, they're also actively cultivating this large and loyal customer base. So Prime membership globally is up to 200 million, but fully 3/4 of those are Americans. And fully 2/3 of all online shoppers in the United States are Amazon Prime members, which, as you probably know, entitles them to free delivery and really fast delivery. So as people, as more and more people use this with growing use, with growing popularity, you get a kind of normalization of these relationships as we all come to really rely and depend on these services. So that in the meantime, most Americans think that it's really perfectly normal to think that these kind of low-priced goods can be delivered to their door within, it used to be 48 hours, now it's 24 hours. In Boston, it's like 3 hours, without so much thinking about the labor model that lies behind that. So thank you for listening, and I'm eager to hear your ideas.
How much of the failure to ever push back against the large-scale retail model had to do with the fact that retail never was unionized, really, or at least in my experience, never seemed to be unionized, and was always dominated by women in the workplace?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the way in which the courts, especially in this crucial period of the late 19th century, really disarticulated a lot of the countervailing forces that could have emerged and did emerge in other countries to kind of push against the big retailers. So I talked a little bit about the cooperatives, which would have been this sort of alternative model of retailing that got off the ground elsewhere. But of course, in this exact same period, the courts were also doing tremendous damage to organized labor, full stop. And so, the antitrust acts were also, and conspiracy laws were also, of course, deployed to disarticulate unions, which is one of the reasons we have the particular union structure that we do, which is not industrial unions, but rather sort of workplace by workplace. They also the courts also, again, partly or largely as a function of the particular antipathy that the courts had for horizontal coordination among smaller entities, among smaller competitors. They also disarticulated trade associations, so on the employer side as well. And all of these would have been potential countervailing forces against the rise of both monopoly and, in this case, monopsony actors. So I would say the courts were pretty implicated in that as well. And it's not like retail is very well organized anywhere, but in other countries, you don't, so where you have, like here, where you have industrial unions, you can do more encompassing agreements that cover a larger number of workers without having to literally go and organize each and every plant. Even in Britain, which again is like our closest cousin, the big retailers like Tesco, or Tesco in particular is like the biggest retailer there. They have an agreement that is with unions that covers all Tesco, all branches. Whereas in the United States, if you've been following how Amazon has to go or Starbucks, you have to go and literally organize each and every outlet, and that is just a far harder task to sort of try to overcome.
Contemporary observers of these trends, did they ever raise their hand and say, we're headed towards the immiseration of our workforce, or the mom and pop shop have absolutely no chance, or were they aware of what was the differences between the U.S. and Europe?
Yeah, so for most, it's like if you're living, so there are different phases of this, but if you're living in, like I come from South Dakota, and if you're living in South Dakota in the late 19th century, and your entire all you can buy is at this local store at very high prices, these big retailers were not seen as dangerous or bad. They were welcomed. They were a godsend. This is how you could have access to all these goods that you could only read about in magazines otherwise. And so they were very much welcomed. And the same thing there's a macroeconomic story that is kind of going on in the background here, because in periods of, in inflationary periods, the people flock to these low-cost retailers for good reason. They flocked to them because they were charging lower prices, and it helped people. It helped them make ends meet. So, what didn't maybe come through clearly, or what's going on in the background here, it was that in periods of depression, when people really started saying, "Whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? Maybe we got to slow this thing down." But by that time, of course, it was kind of over with. And moreover, the government worked with these companies in periods of inflation to, when they were trying to battle inflation, they were absolutely working hand in glove with these low cost retailers, because they were desperate to address consumer demand and consumer, sort of the problem of high prices. So it was a love-hate story, and it still is in very important ways. It's people came to rely on these things,
right.
And they performed a service that wasn't being performed by these small retailers. I don't romanticize the small retailers, because these guys were also, they would put their thumb on the scale, and they would overcharge customers, and so it's not like a good guy, bad guy kind of situation. It was for most people, this was their ticket to get to get some consumer good that wasn't otherwise available.
So one of the things, just talking anecdotally about consumer habits in U.S. versus Europe today, that is often discussed, is that Americans care vastly more about price, and Europeans care vastly more about expertise in the shop and all the way that people working in the shops will direct you towards a better product, so on and so forth. At home, I'm often chided for not having a full appreciation of Fachgeschäft, and it seems as though this is the origins, that somehow Americans were led to believe that price was all that mattered. But you tell me.
Yeah, no, I do think that there are public policy that, I'm a political scientist, and I see these conflicts everywhere, and I think that early victories really set the U.S. on a particular path, and then once you're on that path, then it makes it easier to make the next step, and you have these big operators, and it's very hard for other competitors to get in with another model. I do think, I was talking about Brandeis, and one of the things that Brandeis, he wasn't super in favor of small retailers per se. What he wanted to protect was small, innovative manufacturers, like somebody with a good idea. And what he, I think, understood at the time was that if you have these big retailers, so in alliance with big manufacturers, what you're going to get is standardized goods, and at the expense of sort of niche products and higher quality goods. That there'll be a kind of flattening of the market that they would do, because in order to get on the shelf at Walmart, you already have to be very popular. You can't get on the shelf at Walmart with an unknown sort of niche product.
And finally, and then I'll turn it over to the audience, which will have much more informed questions. You pointed out that it was driven by the jurisprudence of the time. Presumably, there wasn't a partisan difference in the jurisprudence, or was there?
The key. I put a lot of weight on what happened at the late 19th century, and this was the Lochner era court, and this was a court that, for whatever reason, and very unlike even Britain, our common law cousin, really had a very negative perspective on horizontal coordination. I mean, one of the things that we do know about that period is that the way that the court interpreted the Sherman Antitrust Act really led to the so-called Great Merger movement that Naomi Lamoureux and others have written about, which it really sort of encouraged the growth of these big vertically integrated corporations, because, of course, if everything is organized within the context of a single company, then there is no question of conspiracy, there is no question of collusion. And at the same time, it was really doing great damage, as I say, not just to unions, that's a pretty well-known story, but also to the trade associations in the United States, which were very much enfeebled in this period as these small producers really could not survive in that environment and were gobbled up by the big companies. So you had, right in the aftermath of the Sherman Act, you had a great consolidation on the industrial side, where you had really the growth of some of these big corporations. And even when American antitrust turned against those big the big companies, they turned against the manufacturers. And when they turned against the manufacturers, that often operated to the advantage of the big retailers, because a lot of the big conflicts in the period when antitrust was being very strongly enforced in the United States, in the 50s and 60s in particular, a lot of the big cases were of sort of these discounters that I was talking about, wanting to charge lower prices for the goods of these big companies, and the courts weighed in on their side. So antitrust itself is like, it was sometimes when they were ruling, even when they were enforcing antitrust very seriously against the manufacturers, this often redounded to the advantage of some of these low cost retailers.
Okay, questions. That's right here. Just wait for the mic.
Yes, thank you for your fascinating talk. Actually, it's a success story you presented to us. My question is about victims of this success story. I will explain. When I lived in the United States, I ordinarily did my shopping in Trader Joe's. It's a net of shops. So then I realized that Trader Joe's is sorry.
It's German.
It's iconic image of a trader who did his trade in a countryside, in rural areas. In pre-modern Europe, such traders were called as peddlers, and I like very much your point on importance of postal service, providing these financial tools, being intermediary between suppliers and consumers. So what happened to these peddlers or small traders doing their trade in rural areas after coming of postal services, then this chain store, and so on? What happened to these people? Did they became postal officers or highwaymen attacking postal services to get money, or did they become populists, journalists, etc.? What happened to them? Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, they were wiped out. They weren't going to be. They were basically wiped out. This is why you have a sort of, especially in rural areas, you have a real dearth of downtown areas, and the city center is quite wiped out. I don't know what they became in the 19th century. Maybe they maybe they went to, I mean, this is also when you have a great migration out of rural areas, right? As the rural areas were not able to support. First of all, agriculture was getting mechanized to begin with, and then if you don't have a trade as a merchant, as an independent merchant, then you're going to probably wind up in Chicago looking for a job in industry or in Detroit or something like that. And the same thing kind of happens later as well, like when Walmart moves in. I know that a lot of manufacturing, even if they didn't move into your area, a lot of manufacturing jobs were very much affected by Walmart. The China shock that people talk about when China entered the World Trade Organization. It was really a Walmart shock because, like, China by 2004, so the World Trade, the opening was in 2001, if I recall, and by 2004, China was the biggest importer, bigger than any country. And so this was a huge shock. And I know that a lot of those guys became truckers because, of course, when you have big retail, you're going to have huge logistics demands, and that means trucking, among all other things, especially in the United States.
I'm sorry, you said China was the biggest importer. Did you?
No, sorry. Walmart. Did I say Walmart was the biggest importer from China? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. But so one clarification, because Walmart is relatively late in the story,
yeah.
But again, anecdotally, the U.S. in the 50s and 60s, 70s, until the whole kind of urban decay issue came up, there were a lot of very small chains, regional chains. Yeah. Those were they got wiped out by Walmart. But were they benefiting tremendously from the phenomena you're discussing? Well,
the golden era of post-war growth in the U.S. was really the 1950s and into the 60s. I sort of date the beginning of the decline in 62 when these discounters came in, because before that you had a kind of truce between big manufacturers who had big unionized factories that were really being, at this time, unionization was at its American peak, which was never very high, but still it was higher than now. And so there were rents to be shared, and also you had a kind of truce between these retailers who in the pre-war period had been really demanding the right to cut prices. And among the retailers that was really on the bandwagon on the right to cut prices was Macy's. That was actually something that Macy's was talking about. And so Macy's and the big department stores kind of had a truce during that period. Like, we're all making, the economy was awash in money, right? So American manufacturing was dominant worldwide because Europe was rebuilding, and so there were rents to go all around. And so there was kind of a truce in terms of, like, we're not going to squeeze you on the prices that we're willing to pay you for your goods to pass on to consumers. So that was a period when that was kind of the golden era, and it was only these kind of upstart retailers who came in and just really disrupted that whole model. And some of them were regional chains, and some of them were national chains. But to this day, I would say that a lot of grocery stores are more regional chains than they are sort of national chains. Walmart has of course a national presence, and Walmart is in the meantime one of the biggest grocers of all. And that reminds me to say that Aldi here owns Trader Joe's. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's go to that side of the room.
Yes, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. You several times already alluded to this sort of curious interaction between manufacturing and the retail stores. And, what to me is most striking is that manufacturing looks so weak in this, right? So U.S. manufacturing that, for a long time was sort of really dominating so many world markets looks so weak in this story. And then you also said there is this alternative narrative about the decline of manufacturing that is all about exogenous shocks. Now, I'm wondering, I mean, do you think there is maybe more of an interplay between these forces, right? I mean, obviously there is the China shock, but earlier, right, that somehow maybe the reason why some of these big manufacturers were giving in to this pressure was because they were facing already competition from somewhere else? Or, I mean, I'm really just wondering, because it really is surprising me that they give in to this massive monopoly power of the retailers. How come?
So that's a great. These are all great questions, and that's another good one. And it's so it depends which period we're talking about. Partly, they're losing at various points. They're losing, say, in the 1960s to these discounters, and they're losing earlier on. When the South is sort of not able to rein them in. For the period that you're talking about, which is the kind of like 2000s or 1990s and 2000s, right? I mean, a lot of these, I guess the short version of the story is that a lot of these, as other outlets get wiped out, there is a kind of shifting of the balance of power between manufacturing and distribution, right? So in the 1950s, it was a so-called push model where we make this stuff, and you figure out, and we push it out to the retailers, and you figure out how to sell this stuff. But as the number of outlets shrinks, and as more and more companies come to rely more and more on a few big retailers like Walmart, like P&G, Procter and Gamble, was a huge American consumer goods producer. They sell 30% of their stuff through Walmart, and so if they lose Walmart, they are sunk. Right? They have to then conform to the stipulations that Walmart hands down. And so now we're beyond the sort of push model where I make this stuff and you figure out how to sell it. And Walmart is telling them, partly because Walmart has the data to tell them they know exactly what's being sold, in what combination, in which locations, and at what price. And so it's now a pull system where Walmart is now essentially dictating to its suppliers when and how much and under what conditions and how to deliver these goods. So one example of this is that Walmart was a big innovator. It gets a lot of credit for being a big innovator on logistics, because they introduced these scan codes for all their products. But they didn't do that. They ordered their suppliers to comply with that. And so basically they offloaded the costs of all of that transition onto their suppliers. And so part of it is a data issue. Like, they have more data. They know where stuff is getting sold, where stuff is selling. And that gives them an enormous sort of informational advantage over their suppliers. And frankly, they have their choice of suppliers. If P&G doesn't want to play their game, then they can go to some other supplier. Or what you can also do, and what they do sometimes, Walmart less than Amazon, is create your own private brand. And then you can simply do without those suppliers. So there was this tipping point. You're right. There was a point when manufacturers were kind of producing and distributors were trying to had to figure out how to sell this stuff. But it flipped, and the exact timing, it'd be hard to pin down exactly. But I would say in the 70s, basically.
Okay, next. Here, you've been patient.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for interrupting you. I think it's just fascinating to see that Trader Joe's, Crate & Barrel are German-owned. A&P was bought by a German company, which was bought again later on. And I think it's fascinating to see why Walmart failed in Germany. That sort of corroborates your analysis. In Germany, employees don't have to unionize to have rights. They have rights anyway. And Walmart just couldn't handle that. And German workers, you cannot make them jump up and down in the morning, do jumping jacks, and sing the Walmart song. They just don't do it.
Yeah.
We have that problem here too.
And the other thing is, Walmart faced fierce competition, and the prices in Germany in retail are even lower than in the US. And that has something to do with the antitrust approach. And the Chicago school you mentioned, and I thought it was fascinating that you pointed out that this focus on price goes way back into history. That's not an invention of the Chicago school. Yeah. But still, the Chicago antitrust looks at price and behavior and coordination and cartels. And the European approach, the EU, and, well, later on, national antitrust laws, they look at structure. Mm-hmm. And in merger control, the amount of vertical integration is an argument about structure. And so antitrust does not equal antitrust. And so I thought this really corroborates your analysis about regulation, antitrust, lack of regulation, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Yeah.
It reminds me of there was a New York Times story years ago analyzing why Toys R Us failed in Germany. Uh-huh. And the conclusion was that German consumers felt that such low prices must mean that it was all crap.
Yeah, no, the pricing is a big signaling thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry for that barnyard episode.
No.
As we say. Abe, you had a question.
Yes, first of all, I thought it was such a fascinating talk, and the images and the data was amazing. I thought it was so cool. But I wanted to ask about gender because I've lived in Germany many times in my life, and it's always that how do you go shopping if you're a two-earner couple in a system where stores are never open except for somebody who doesn't work? And so I think there's many ways that gender feeds into your story, or how these mass retailers impact gender, both as employers, as people that shop. I can imagine that they also encourage women's groups that then lobby for them. Anyway, I would appreciate you speaking a little bit of, I can imagine also that then they lead to these lower paid jobs that then entrap women into these sectors that are not. I just think there's a lot of ways that you could think about that, and I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah. So gender does play a role here. I mean, it plays a role historically because women, even before in the U.S., even before they could vote, they were seen as the representative of consumers, and they were big players actually in sort of monitoring prices when the government was trying to monitor prices and ratting out all of these merchants who were overcharging and so forth. Sort of fast forward to more recent. Women were a big part of the reason that shopping hours got liberalized in the countries that it did, in Europe. They were a huge part of that for exactly the reason that you're talking about. Retail is overwhelmingly women, and it's overwhelming in all these countries, and it's overwhelmingly part-time work, and it's overwhelmingly precarious work, really, and so they're. Yeah, so women show up in this story. In the U.S. case, mostly as price hawks. They're looking for low prices because they are the ones who may or may not have a job, but who are charged with making ends meet in the household economy. And in terms of shopping hours, they weren't really the ones that were pushing for this, to be honest. So they weren't really the ones that were pushing for this, but they're the ones who are definitely working in these retailers. But that's kind of true everywhere, I would say. So.
Wow, we still have lots of questions. Right here. We'll go one and then two. And we'll have to do it quickly.
Okay. So.
That's just a short comment on Walmart in...
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. On Walmart in Germany, I think they didn't fail because they didn't understand German culture and etc. I think they failed because they never got the economies of scale in Germany, which they need to operate profitably. But what I also find interesting, the relationship between manufacturers or producers and the retailers, what I think should be mentioned is that the national brands, they have their advertising. They do advertise, and this is their relationship with the customer. So they are actively engaging in a relationship with the customers. And how companies reacted to that is perhaps different in Germany, or many retailers in the United States too, and in Europe too, but especially in Germany, retailers have developed their private labels.
Yeah.
And the market share of private labels in Germany is much higher than it is in the United States. And this then are very weak manufacturers which have this relationship. Frequently they produce only for one retailer a certain product, a private label, a juice or some meat or some any other product. And such weak retailers, I don't know whether manufacturers are that weak in the United States. Because when you look at Procter & Gamble and Walmart, Procter & Gamble probably also profited very much from the special relationship with Walmart and getting the data and getting information about the customers. Being sometimes even setting up the assortment, managing the assortment of Walmart. So I'm not sure whether retailers in the United States are strong and manufacturers are weak, and in Germany, manufacturers are strong and retailers are weak.
So that's a great question. It depends on, different companies operate differently. Like Aldi and Lidl, it's like 90% private label stuff. You will go in there and it's private. That is not Walmart's sweet spot. That's not where they want to be, because they actually explicitly say, we want to sell brand goods below the cost that you can get them anywhere else. And so there's actually quite a lot of variation in terms of what these different companies are doing. And in Germany, yes, it's at least in the hard discounters. I would say hard discounting in Germany is pretty concentrated in a couple of sectors, in particular groceries. In the U.S., it's widespread. It's much more widespread. And the difference is that the companies that, like Walmart, the reason they were going like this with the manufacturers was that manufacturers were paying huge advertising fees, big bucks to make sure that everyone knew that theirs was the best product. And if you then see that at Walmart for half the price, people then do begin to wonder if it's, whether what they've been paying for this whole time. So there is a lot of variation. Tesco, I could go into various, but like Tesco has private brands at different price points. Different retailers are going for different market segments. And Walmart is quite clearly all about brand goods at the lowest possible price. And so you're right to say that it's a more differentiated picture, and I've flattened it a little bit because I'm trying to cover a big chunk of time. But you're absolutely right to point that out. I think that's a good point.
Let me make this the last question.
Thank you very much for this really interesting lecture. It also has a personal aspect to me because my family owned a chain of discount stores in the Southeast, and we eventually sold to Walmart in the early 80s. So I wanted to sort of ask you about, you said that Walmart and Target and Kmart, they all got started in '62. And you have the harnessing of not just of technology with the barcodes. That was one of the things that my family store had a lot of problems with implementing. And so it seems to me that it's not just getting respond. It's a two-way street with Walmart and these stores in the center. They're taking advantage of being established at the right time, so that they can tell the manufacturers, but also respond to the customer needs faster than these smaller chains. But was that common with these other smaller chains as well? And when was the movement for for cannibalizing not just these small mom and pop stores, but the regional chains that weren't necessarily grocery stores?
Yeah, so it was, Walmart had kind of the opposite strategy with Amazon. Like Walmart grew very methodically, almost, starting in the South, and it grew and grew and grew, and it would cluster its stores, in various locations until it, over decades really developed an international or a national presence and tried to go to other. It had more success in places like Mexico, but anyway, it now kind of blankets the United States. Amazon's strategy was totally different. It was like, we're going to just we're going to go profitless for a long time and just grow as big as possible. And so, it depends on, in the South, they were hit first, I would say, and as it grew, it developed more outposts everywhere. I did want to say one thing about the U.S. is in a very, and this I think is different from Europe. So I think there are a lot of you are talking about some elements of European that have kind of Germany that have kind of moved in the direction of the U.S. on some of this, and I think that's absolutely right, especially these hard discounters and so forth. One thing that is really different, and one thing that puts us in a very, very, very deep equilibrium with these low-cost retailers, and that is that now they are not just popular, they're not just big, they're not just ubiquitous, they are part of the infrastructure of people's lives. And without them, people cannot make ends meet. But moreover, what surprised me even is that we're talking about a country in which sort of healthcare is very spotty, and we don't have a good healthcare infrastructure. So when it came time to distribute vaccines in the United States, who did they work with? There was no public infrastructure to work with. So the way that they got vaccines to these remote rural populations was through Walmart. I got a vaccine at Walmart. I went to Walmart to get my vaccine. So this is what I mean about a very deep equilibrium. You cannot simply get rid of these things. If you got rid of these things, so much hinges on them in the meantime. I'm not advocating for them. I'm just saying the reality is we have got a system where we've made ourselves quite dependent on some of these large retailers, also and including for really public health functions in a way that I think is quite perverse.
Actually, before we end, that seems to me to be a good segue. Did you want to say another minute or two about the American political economy project? I mean, it seems as though that leads right into it.
Yeah, no, so the American Political Economy Project is something that I launched together with Jacob Hacker at Yale, Alex Hurdle-Fernandez, who is at Columbia, but currently he's in the Labor Department in the Biden administration, and Paul Pearson at Berkeley. And basically it's a consortium of universities, and what we're trying to do is inspire more work on American capitalism in a comparative perspective, because American politics tends to be dominated by people who study public opinion and elections. Very important, like, don't get me wrong, that's all really important, but Americanists have not typically been studying things like the courts, the role of the courts, antitrust, the role of big business, et cetera. And we think that these are really on the agenda right now in an important way. And we also believe that you can see things differently. You can begin to see things about the United States that are very taken for granted. Like the idea that we distribute vaccines through large retailers. Like, that is not a thing in other countries. But, Americans take this kind of thing totally for granted. And so part of the idea is looking at the American system from outside the American system to identify, where it is that it's truly distinctive, and what implications that has for the kinds of outcomes that we're getting in the United States, whether that's the, democratic backsliding or especially high and rising inequality. So that's our project. That's our movement.
Well, you heard it here, and I hope you'll come back to hear about it again. Thank you so much for a terrific presentation.
Thank you very much.